you very much, Priscilla. Before I introduce Sarah, I'd like to mention that we have a few guests here who I would like to introduce you to. One is Carl Morton. Can you hear me?
No.
How come? I'm speaking as loud as I can. Is that better? Yeah. I'd like to introduce a few guests and special people who are now here in Oxfordshire. One is Carl Martin. Would you stand up, Carl, so people can see you? He is a mitochondrial expert who works at the John Radcliffe Hospital. He's applied for a grant to do some research into ME, and he's got some funding, so hopefully that will go ahead. He's being assisted in the research by Fiona Duxbury. Will you stand up, Fiona? She is the new CFS ME team in Oxfordshire, GP with special interest. One other person, well, some of you have met Anne Silk before. She gave a lecture to us, Dr. Anne Silk, who's an expert researcher on her own. And also Iman Amanpour. Would you stand up, Iman? I will talk a bit about Omega members who are ill now, and of course Sarah will talk about all kinds of people who are ill with ME. My wife Sylvia is still ill with it, but our son, who's now 37, when he was 16 years old, he came down with it. And Sylvia nurtured him and did the right things, but we also had some help from Iman Amanpour, who lives in Grove. Would you stand up, Iman? And I'm not sure how much Iman helped our son, but anyway, our son, as far as I'm concerned, is 99.9% cured. So, also, we have Professor Joe Poulton down on her knees, and thank you so much,
Well,
Joe,
I hope it's compatible with the right version of PowerPoint.
for bringing your laptop, because Sarah neglected to bring hers, and this hotel apparently doesn't have one. Because I got to say a few things. Do you want me to skip? You are here, everybody knows about you, but to me as a physicist, chronic fatigue syndrome, the fatigue in that, as a physicist, is synonymous with lack of energy. And most of the energy you have, normally more than 90% of it is provided by mitochondria. And Sarah is one of the few doctors I know who has carried out tests on mitochondrial function. Well, the actual tests are done by John McLaren Howard, who's established the Biolab company, and then when he retired, he started trading as Acumen. And at the conference I went to in 2007, the second conference sponsored by Invest in ME, Sarah gave an invited talk there. And one of the slides she showed really impressed me because it showed the relationship between clinical ability and mitochondrial dysfunction. And I thought, gee, that should be published, because I'd started to look at literature a bit on ME. And also I could see that the straight line fit on the graph was not quite correct. So I asked Sarah, look, send me the data, I will do a plot and help you publish it. So eventually, after a lot of delays and hard work, we first published a paper, and I wanted it to be open access, which was rather rare at that time. It's become very popular now. But in open access, the authors have to pay for the paper to be published. Otherwise, anyone who wants to read the paper either has to subscribe to the journal or pay a fee to read the paper. And so most scientists get the money to pay the publication charges from the research grant. But since we don't have a research grant now, or didn't then, the journal kindly waived the publication fee. Since then, we've published 2 more papers, and Sarah keeps sending me data, which
Poor man.
yes, but I've got a new helper who's the son of ME Association trustee Nikki Strong, who's sitting here next to Priscilla. Nikki has now joined Omega, and her son Jamie, next to Carl Morton there, is helping with the analysis of further data. So I won't say anything more about this. I remember Sarah's unhappy dealings with the General Medical Council and how these were solved, but I won't talk about them now. And she was also a GP with special interest in the NHS multidisciplinary team in Shropshire. It's the equivalent of what we used to call OCMET in Oxfordshire. But there she was not permitted to recommend or carry out any tests, and was not permitted even to give advice to local GPs. So she had no choice but to resign. But my darling wife Sylvia, who's sitting over there, has told me, Sarah is the only person who ever helped me with ME, taken tests and found things that are wrong. So you see that Sarah's got 2 new books out. The first one, Diagnosis and Treatment of CFS, it's mitochondria, not hypochondria, was reviewed and awarded a highly commended certificate by the British Medical Association Book Awards. And this year she's published Sustainable Medicine. And at my request, she's brought some copies along. So I won't say any more. If any of you are urgently want to ask a question, then please wave and I will interrupt Sarah and you can ask it. Otherwise, I've already got 3 questions on slips of paper, and at the interval she can then answer these questions later. Okay, I won't say any more. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you, Norman, very much. I don't think there's a... That works. To an arrow thingy to join. There's a pointer.
Okay, but
one of us will arrow.
oh, just move on. Okay, well, that's what I do in my spare time. That's what I'll be doing tomorrow at the Bicester Team Chase, or would have been, but unfortunately it's cancelled because of wet. But that's my lovely horse, Maggie. Righty ho. So that doesn't
Is
work.
Sarah speaking loudly enough?
Okay. Now, what I've done is I've prepared enough slides for 2 hours of talking. I can't, and we're not going to talk for 2 hours, obviously, but it's all there. So some of this stuff I'm going to skip over. But what I want you to get an idea of is the overall view of how I think about people with fatigue syndromes and how that has implications for management. Because the things I'm asking my patients to do are very difficult. They're hard work, they're major lifestyle changes, and unless they understand exactly why we're having to do these things, then they won't have the power, the brain power, the determination to carry through with them. So, the key point about chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia, because the 2 things come together, is they are not diagnoses. So many people get palmed off with, oh, you've got chronic fatigue syndrome, and it's the chronic fatigue syndrome that's giving you your muscle aching. It's the chronic fatigue syndrome that's making you tired. Rubbish. They are just clinical pictures. And whenever we have a clinical picture, we have to ask the question why. What's the underlying mechanisms that result in that clinical picture? Because that is a true diagnosis. You know, what's going wrong that's resulting in these awful symptoms? Now, I have a very simple starting point, which is that fatigue is the symptom we experience when energy demand exceeds energy delivery. It's a very simple idea that everybody get their head round. And that means there are both sides of the equation that we have to pay attention to. The one I like to quote is Mr. McCormick from Charles Dickens, next one. Famously said, annual income £20, outgoing 19 shillings and sixpence, result happiness. If it's higher than that, result misery. And so it is the same with energy. We can generate energy in our body and we can spend energy. And the difference between the two is what gives us the symptom of fatigue. So, in chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, that's the clinical picture that arises when energy demand chronically outstrips energy delivery. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, why is our energy pot small? Why is it we don't have the energy to spend in a day? And are we using energy in a wasteful fashion? Pain is also a really important symptom. It protects us from ourselves. And people who don't have pain sensation do terrible damage to themselves. So one of the things I stress to my patients is don't mask symptoms with drugs, because we have symptoms for very good reasons. It's the early warning, flag saying something's wrong, do something about it. Okay, and again. So that's our overall strategy. And so how do we spend our energy? So fatigue is the symptom that stops us overspending. And we can spend our energy in different ways. First of all, basic housekeeping duties. Just the business of staying alive. Basal metabolic rate, so keeping warm, brain function, heart function, gut function, takes up about 2/3 of all our energy. It's a big energy spender. We then spend energy mentally and physically. And guess what? At the end of the day, when I've been expending energy mentally and physically, I'm tired. We have an emotional hole in our energy bucket, and that's a big problem for many people with fatigue syndromes. We have what I call an immunological hole in the bucket, and I could talk all day about that. Okay, we'll go on to the next slide then. Okay, so that's what I just talked about. So the housekeeping and so on. And again. Okay, and again. So, and again. So, I say the car analogy is that, our bodies are very much like a car. So go on to the next one too. Okay. I'm always coming back to this analogy with my patients. It's an easy analogy to get their head around. And this is all about energy delivery mechanisms. And the body is, basically it's a machine, and very much like a car. And the engine of our car are the mitochondria. And what mitochondria do is they take fuel from the bloodstream, which may be sugar or ketones. It burns fuel in the presence of oxygen, which again comes in from the bloodstream to generate energy, the ATP molecule. So for that engine to work, we've got to have the right fuel in the tank. And that is all about diet and gut function. I spend more time talking about diet, food, what we eat, how the gut works, than everything else put together. I don't see the mitochondria unimportant, but that's relatively easy to solve. Diet is the big problem. Oxygen is an obvious cause of fatigue. Even the conventional doctors recognise if your lungs fail, if your heart fails, if you're anemic, you're going to present with a chronic fatigue syndrome. The accelerator pedal of the car is the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland controls not only how fast mitochondria go, but also the numbers of mitochondria. So when I correct thyroid function for people, they often get an immediate benefit because the mitochondria can go a little bit faster, but then there's a more long-term benefit as the actual numbers of mitochondria pick up. And I often pick up hypothyroidism when we do mitochondrial function tests, because John McLaren Howard comments that there aren't many mitochondria in this person's cells. Roughly speaking, a heart cell will have between 2,000 and 3,000 mitochondria. The cell that has more mitochondria than any other in the body is the female egg, or is the egg in the woman, which has about 100,000 mitochondria. A male sperm only has about 10,000. And at the point of fertilization, the female mitochondria kill all the male mitochondria. And what that tells us is that mitochondria come down the female line. Anyway, the adrenal gland is like the gearbox of the car. That allows us to move up a gear in response to stress. And if you look at life from an evolutionary point of view, we have to gear energy expenditure to energy demand very closely. If we don't, we waste energy. And if we waste energy, that's a huge evolutionary disadvantage because it means we're at risk of starving through the winter. Sleep is when we have service and repair. That's when we heal and correct the damage that's been done by during the day. The point is, mitochondria can't burn energy with 100% efficiency, and there's always a little bit of collateral damage, and it's during sleep that heals and repairs. The toolkit is the methylation cycle and other bits and bobs there I'm not going to go into because we haven't got time. Okay, so the clinical picture is fatigue occurs when we have very poor stamina. That's because the mitochondria go slow. And we have delayed fatigue. And I think both of these can be explained in terms of poor mitochondrial function. And again? Okay, now if we have, the heart is greatly demanding of energy. And if energy delivery to the heart is impaired, then it doesn't beat powerfully as a pump. And this combination of poor fuel delivery, if you like, because the heart doesn't beat powerfully, together with mitochondrial function, poor mitochondrial function, explains the multiplicity of symptoms in people who have fatigue syndromes. And people come to me with shopping lists of symptoms. And as they come, I try and sort them into, those are poor energy delivery symptoms, those are allergy symptoms, those are chronic infection symptoms, whatever. But these are the poor energy delivery symptoms. But first of all, the muscles have no stamina. Why? Because the mitochondria don't work efficiently. And when the mitochondria don't work efficiently, they don't work aerobically, there's an early switch into anaerobic metabolism, and that gives lactic acid burn. As Norman points out, it's not the lactic acid that causes the problem, it's the hydrogen ions, but this is the usual explanation that people accept. And that's one explanation for the symptom of fibromyalgia. The brain is enormously demanding of energy. At rest, the brain will be consuming about 20% of all the energy produced in the body. Interestingly, in the newborn baby, 60% of all the energy is being used in the brain for neurodevelopment. But the point is the brain needs a vast amount of energy. Again, it comes in the form of ATP. And if you can't generate energy fast enough for the brain to work, then you will get what I call all the symptoms of foggy brain. Can't think clearly, poor concentration, can't multitask, procrastination, and all those things. Those cognitive dysfunction symptoms are incredibly common, if not universal, in my ME patients. The eye, interestingly, the retina of the eye uses a vast amount of energy in order to convert a light signal into a signal that the brain can read. It uses energy, weight for weight, 10 times faster than the brain. And I think this partly explains that the very severe ME patients are very light intolerant. They have to lie down, they're in a darkened room, and they're probably, and they're often intolerant of noise for the same reason. The brain just cannot process that information that's coming in. The immune system is enormously demanding of energy. How do I know that? Because if I give a normal person flu, they are bedbound for days and weeks. There's some lovely work done by Caroline Pond, who asked the question, where do wild mammals dump their fat when they get a little bit of excess fuel in or excess food in during the autumn? And the answer is they dump it around their lymph nodes and they dump it in their bone marrow, because the immune system is fat-loving and requires an awful amount of energy for the work that it does. I think of the immune system as a mobile brain, and just like the brain, it requires a huge amount of energy. Joints and connective tissue, we need energy for healing and repair. Skin, again, it's a feature of my severe chronic fatigue syndrome patients that they're very intolerant of heat and intolerant of cold. Now, they're intolerant of heat because in order to lose heat, you have to pump blood to the skin. The skin is the largest organ in the body, and roughly you increase the cardiac output by about 20% in the business of losing heat. The ME patients can't do that. They're already in a state of borderline heart failure, and they cannot increase their output in order to cool. And the same thing, if it's cold, if your mitochondria go slow, they cannot generate the heat to keep warm. So my ME patients are intolerant of cold, and they're intolerant of the heat. Again, the liver, I find this an astonishing statistic, which is that the liver consumes about 27% of all the energy generated in the body. It does a massive job dealing with toxic gut. There's a condition called Gilbert syndrome, which is characterised by high bilirubin, and essentially those peoples are slow detoxifier. Gilbert syndrome is a major risk factor for chronic fatigue syndrome. Again, my favourite diet at the moment is the ketogenic diet, and the point here is that we have been misled with decades of very poor nutritional advice. We should be powering our body with fat. It's the easiest food to ferment, to digest, but most importantly, it's very non-toxic. It doesn't need any processing by the liver. How do I know that? Because fat goes straight into the lymphatics and into the thoracic duct. It's a very easy food for the body to deal with, and of course very energy dense. Okay, hormone synthesis, same thing. And what we know in patients with fatigue syndromes is there's a general suppression of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. That was work done by Professor Behan, who studied patients who'd been poisoned by organophosphates and patients who had post-viral fatigue syndromes, and they had a very similar suppression of the HPA axis. Kidneys, many of my chronic fatigue syndromes have low glomerular filtration rates, and again, I suspect that's an energy delivery issue. Cardiac symptoms in chronic fatigue syndrome are extremely common because energy delivery to the muscle, the heart muscle, is poor, and therefore it cannot beat powerfully. Now, there's an early switch, therefore, into anaerobic production, into anaerobic metabolism, and that produces lactic acid. And lactic acid burn in the heart is angina. Now, it's not recognised as angina because typically the angina, it's due to poor blood supply. Somebody walks up a hill, they get the chest pain, they stop, and the pain disappears very quickly. Those people, although they've got poor blood supply to the heart, they've got good mitochondrial function. Now, with the ME patients, they can't switch back from anaerobic to aerobic metabolism because their mitochondria are so awful, and therefore the pain is very persistent. So they get their angina pain, and that's what it is, but it doesn't go away when they rest. It's very persistent. So they often get diagnosed with atypical chest pain, which isn't a diagnosis at all, of course. They often have low blood pressure, postural hypertension with POTS, and other cardiac symptoms. And again, I suspect these are all poor energy delivery mechanisms. Now, I learned most of this from a cardiologist called Stephen Sinatra, who was a very conventional cardiologist working in America. And he developed the idea that many heart disease problems are mitochondrial issues. And to cut a long story short, he found he got better results using a mitochondrial package of supplements to treat patients with heart failure, heart disease, than conventional therapy. Okay, so I say I'm going to whiz through this because I'm sure you're all familiar with it, and it's there in my book, and you'll all go to sleep if I yeah.
Oh, no, please.
She was diagnosed with Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome.
Yeah.
And had the operation, and we thought the operation caused the issue, but could having had that problem?
Well, Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome is a conduction problem in that, and my guess is that's a completely separate issue, and that's probably something to do with the anatomy and the electrical circuits being. But I mean, Sinatra recommends a mitochondrial approach for almost any electrical, problem of the heart. But I think that's probably a side issue. Okay, so say mitochondria are the engine of our cars, and it's an incredibly efficient system. From one molecule of glucose, you can potentially make between 32 and 36 molecules of ATP. It's incredibly efficient. We get a lot of ATP, let's say, from one molecule. And, of course, that happens in mitochondria. Next one, thank you, please. Okay, and this is the simplistic idea of how it works. Which is the pointer? Is the pointer on there? No, do you know which is the pointer on here? Don't know what about that. Do you know which is the pointer on there?
Oh, okay.
Is it the orange one or? No idea. Oh, there it is. There it is. Okay. So mitochondria, they take fuel, burn it at the presence of oxygen, and they convert ADP, which is the diphosphate, into ATP, which is moved out of mitochondria into the cells to produce energy. So that's the simplistic overview. And again, okay. I think of ATP as the currency of energy. It's like money. With ATP, you can buy any job in the body. And what we have in chronic fatigue syndrome is poor recycling of ATP, and say we don't have the currency of energy to do things in the body, to do jobs in the body. Okay, so what happens if we stress the system? Now, by stressing the system, I mean we ask for energy from mitochondria faster than the mitochondria can provide it. Now, athletes do this when they compete. What happens is they switch into, if they can't produce energy fast enough, then ATP all gets converted to ADP, and that builds up. There is another mechanism where two molecules of ATP can combine together to make one of ATP and one of AMP. It's okay. In the short term, it gives you a little bit of extra energy, but in the longer term, it's disaster because AMP is very poorly recycled. I think the next diagram actually shows that a little bit more easily. Go on again. Okay, so if we haven't got enough ATP to make ADP, then two of these will combine to make AMP. Now the point about that is that can't be recycled. It gets stuck as AMP. It's lost out of the body, actually, as uric acid. So we're actually draining molecules of ATP constantly out of the system, and it doesn't take, you don't have to be very clever to work out, you're going to hit a brick wall very quickly. So that explains why my ME patients have very poor stamina. We then have to replenish the ATP. Now we can do that from glucose. There's a nasty bit of biochemistry called the pentose phosphate shunt to make D-ribose, and D-ribose is a 5-carbon sugar, which is the raw material to make ATP. But that doesn't happen immediately. That takes time. And I suspect that that explains the delayed fatigue that we see in fatigue syndrome patients when they really overdo things and stress the system. Okay. Next one, please. Okay. So having had this idea, and I've been thinking about this through the 1990s and chatting with John McLaren Howard, as Norman mentioned. Initially, John McLaren set up some tests to look at individual respiratory enzymes, the complexes 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 mitochondria, and there wasn't a good correlation. And I stamped my little foot and patted my little lips and says, no, I want a measure of ATP. And John came up with a test, which we call ATP studies. And again, now, essentially, it measures lots of different things. It measures how quickly ATP can make oxidative phosphorylation. Just put it just next one, see if that comes up. Oh no, go back again. Okay. It measures various things. It measures how efficiently ATP is made. It measures the amount of ATP in the cytosol of cells. It measures how efficiently energy is released, and that's a magnesium-dependent process. And it measures how efficiently ATP is moved from the mitochondria into the cell, and how ADP is moved from the cell back into the mitochondria again. And we also measure things. These are all nasty bits of slides that you really don't want to look at too closely, but these are the sort of other syndromes we get with mitochondrial disease. And what you can see is many of the symptoms that we see in known mitochondrial diseases are very similar to those of the ME patient. Things like exercise intolerance, lactic acidosis, cardiomyopathy, muscle weakness, ataxia, mental confusion, metabolic acidosis. All these things are symptomatic of poor mitochondrial function. So these are the various things that we measure. I'll go on to the next one. And the next one. Okay, so this is a typical result I get back from Acumen when we do mitochondrial function tests. We can see the ratio of ATP to ATP magnesium, which gives us an idea of how well energy is released, how efficiently ATP is made. It should be above 60%, and this is obviously poor conversion. The business of making ATP can go slow either because the mitochondria is short of substrate, hasn't got the raw materials to do the job, or because it's blocked by something. And in this case, we can see the active sites are actually blocked. We're allowed up to 14% blocking, and that's 30% blocked.
Is it a blood test?
Yes, it's a blood test. And actually, at the moment, I haven't told them on this, I've got another laboratory that is hopefully going to be able to reproduce this test, so that will help a lot because John's absolutely overworked. And then he looks at the ability of the mitochondria to move ATP from within the mitochondria into the cytosol. Now, and that is a function of translocated protein. Now, translocated proteins make up about 80% of mitochondrial membranes. So, that's what mitochondria do. They just shovel ATP into the cell where it's needed and then drag it back for recycling. And he looks at the ability to move ATP out. It's a slight difficulty is because translocated protein in refers to the direction in which translocated protein is looking, not the way in which ATP is going. Okay, and the next slide. Now, the point... Okay, and the next one. Now, the point is, any one of those processes going slow, either making ATP or moving it around or releasing energy from, will impair energy delivery. And so by multiplying up all those different factors, we can get an energy score. Next slide. Now, by the mid-2000s, I'd collected 71 patients who'd done my basic workup. They'd done the Stone Age diet. They were pacing their level activity as well as they possibly could. We'd sleep. They were on a basic package of nutritional supplements. We corrected their thyroid function. We'd improved their adrenal function. And I was stuck with them. We weren't making progress. So this test then became available from John McLaren Howard. And we set up a system whereby I and the patient agreed their ability score. So they looked at the Bell Disability Scale, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and said, yes, I'm about 70% of where I should be, or I'm about 20% of where I should be, or whatever. I then took the blood tests and sent them blind to Acumen, so John didn't know what the clinical score was. John did the test, and then one of my secretaries scored it to give us a mitochondrial function score, and then we sent all this horrible data up to Norman, who actually wrote the paper. Okay, next one. That's the abstract. The next one. Okay. To my mind, this was the graph that said it all. And essentially, this is a measure of the mitochondrial energy score, which is the clinical score, against, I beg your pardon, that's the objective biochemical measurement, and that's how people were clinically. And as you can see, there's a very good correlation. This is the control group. These are normal people. So those people who had 10 out of, at this level, these people are bedbound. At this level, people are housebound, and at this level, they have to severely curtail their activities. But what you can see is there's a very nice straight line relationship. And this tells us that mitochondrial function is not the whole story, but it's a very important player in people with fatigue syndromes. Now, one way where this test has been extremely useful is for the businesses of getting benefits for patients, because they can get the mitochondrial function test done. I can tell them how fatigued they are. They don't have to tell me. And I don't think we've ever lost an application or an appeal for benefits for people with fatigue syndromes once they've had this test done. So from a practical point of view, it's been very helpful. Okay, now this test additionally tells us why the mitochondria are going slow, because we routinely measure magnesium levels, we routinely measure ATP, which is corrected to help with D-ribose. Vitamin B3 seems to be a very important cofactor. CoQ10, again, a very important cofactor, the most important electron acceptor and donator within mitochondria. Acetyl-carnitine is necessary to get acetate groups from the cell into the mitochondria, so I think that is the fuel pipe of the fuel delivery, and gives us an idea of whether B12 is going to be helpful or not. And also it tells us if the mitochondria are blocked for whatever reason. And they can be blocked because the business of oxidative phosphorylation, which is actually making ATP within the mitochondria, is going slow, or because the ability to move ATP out of the cell, which happens by translocated protein, we can tell if that translocated protein is blocked. So again, that's a very helpful clinical thing. Is that person deficient in something? Do we have to give them supplements? Or are they blocked by something? Do we have to do some sort of detox regime to try and work out what they're blocked by? And I'm going to whiz through these tests because basically Acumen has developed a whole range of further tests to look at that. So just flip through these quickly. That's microrespirometry test. That looks at the rate of oxidative phosphorylation and how it compares with a normal. And again, this is a level of B3, which as you can see is a very low level, and that person is going to be greatly improved by correcting their B3 levels. And again, this is a good example of translocated protein study where John has found anthracene, malondialdehyde, which is a product of poor antioxidant status, so that person I'd give them lots of minerals and vitamin B12 and vitamin C, because that helps mop that up. And again, these are cardiolipin studies. This is looking at the actual quality of the membrane that surrounds mitochondria. Interestingly, it's a lipid which is unique to mitochondria, and that makes perfect biological sense because from an evolutionary perspective, mitochondria are once free-living organisms, and there was a very happy symbiosis that occurred hundreds of millions of years ago when the eukaryotic cells absorbed mitochondria into them, and the mitochondria found a very comfortable environment within the cell, and the cell had a free energy source from the mitochondria. But the mitochondrial membranes are very different from the cell membranes, and indeed mitochondria have their own DNA as well, as I'm sure you're aware. I rarely do this test because it doesn't have much implications for management, but essentially when mitochondria are malfunctioning, magnesium leaks out and calcium leaks in. And calcium within cells is extremely damaging. In fact, the doctor there who's talking about electromagnetic frequency earlier, Dr. Martin Paul has demonstrated that the mechanism by which electromagnetic frequency disrupts cells and causes fatigue is it disrupts the gating membrane, the gating system of membranes, and calcium fluxes into cells. Calcium fluxing in cells is highly toxic, and pretty much everything goes slow. Now, this is another test that Acumen does, which is an incredibly helpful test, which is a measure of cell-free DNA. Now, again, it's done on a blood test, and he measures the amount of DNA in the bloodstream that isn't within a cell. Now, of course, all DNA should be contained within a cell. So this is a sign of cell damage. And some of my ME patients have very high levels of cell-free DNA in their blood. And that would be typical of somebody who's on cancer chemotherapy or had acute flu, or, for example, had a major road traffic accident. Then you'd get so many cells smashed up in the body, you'd get all this DNA swilling around in the bloodstream. So that alone is typical of major pathology. Another test he does is lactate dehydrogenase, isoenzymes. Again, it's another lovely test of tissue damage. And from the different isoenzyme types, we can determine whether it comes from the liver or from the heart or from a normal muscle. But again, it's often abnormal in case of ME. It's a very lovely indication that ME is a pathological condition with evidence of cell damage. Next one. These are the common causes of high cell-free DNA. Not pacing well. If I measured Steve Redgrave's cell-free DNA after an Olympic, winning effort, it would probably be high, because those guys exercise themselves, to the point of unconsciousness. In fact, a very good friend of mine is an Olympic rower, and he said that, when you are rowing, at the point when you go over the line, you should be almost unconscious. And he says, as he's getting to the line, he sees his whole vision shutting down. So so by the time he crosses the line, he's actually blind because he doesn't have enough energy to power the eye, and they're pretty much, let's say, losing consciousness. And of course, they do terrible damage at that time. This is a measure of two of the most important antioxidants in the system. When mitochondria function, just like a car, you can't work with perfect efficiency, and you do produce free radicals. So we're producing these free radicals. Their lifespan is measured in billionths of a second, but they're very damaging. So we have an antioxidant system that mops those nasty, toxic, unpaired electrons, those nasty toxic radicals, before they have a chance to cause damage. And the most important ones are superoxide dismutase, glutathione peroxidase, and coenzyme Q10. And we measure those routinely. And almost invariably, we find deficiencies. And again, that's CoQ10, which is low, and again. Okay, so then we can ask questions, if the mitochondria are blocked, what's the nature of that blocking? And there are various tests we can do to ascertain that. We can measure what's stuck into DNA, we can do fat biopsies to see what's in there, and we can do challenge tests. So I'll just give you a quick example of the sort of things that we find. That probably comes later. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, if somebody's anemic, has lung failure, heart failure, then obviously they're going to be fatigued. Next one. Okay, we talked about that, and again, I'm racing through these a little bit. Okay, this is very useful to understand what the Cori cycle is all about. And it's a nasty bit of biochemistry, but this is important for the patients who have ME. Now, aerobic metabolism, as I mentioned, one molecule of glucose produces 36 molecules of ATP. It's incredibly efficient. Now, if your mitochondria go slow, you switch into anaerobic metabolism. That's incredibly inefficient. One molecule of glucose produces 2 molecules of ATP. It's a pathetically small amount. It's useful to give us that little bit of extra energy for escaping our saber-toothed tiger, but it's a very tiny amount. Now, the trouble is, when you produce your 2 molecule of ATP, you produce lactic acid. To get lactic acid back to glucose, or rather pyruvate, requires 6 molecules of ATP. So it's a poor deal. You spend 2 molecules of ATP, but it costs you 6 molecules to get back to where you were. And of course, the ME patients absolutely can't do that because they don't have the mitochondrial function. The athletes can do it because as soon as they stop running, they can get rid of their lactic acid very quickly. But the fatigue syndromes can't. It takes hours, sometimes days. And so that's why I think it's we get the atypical angina. And so the pain that people experience in their heart and in their muscles is very persistent when they overdo things. And it emphasises the importance of pacing carefully and again. Okay, that's it in a nutshell. This is where energy is impaired. We're getting 2 molecules of ATP and 2 molecules of lactic acid. To convert that back requires 6 molecules of ATP. It's a raw deal. And again. Okay, and again we'll skip over this, I think. Okay, that's all about fibromyalgia. Keep going. Just a little thing, how important the immune system is for healing and repair. And again, this is a good clinical tip. This is work done by William Kaufman in 1949, who published his book, The Common Cause of Joint Dysfunction, osteoarthritis essentially. And he took 1,500 patients and measured how their joints, the range of their joints. He went through the body systematically from the neck, the shoulders, all the joints, and came up with a score. He then treated them with niacinamide. Now that's vitamin B3. It's almost invariably deficient in my patients with fatigue syndromes. And it is a centrally important part of energy delivery mechanisms. But he just gave them vitamin B3 in high doses. Next one. I apologise for the quality of this, but essentially he looked at babies from the age of 3 to 5, and at this age these are people in their 80s and their 90s. And what he found is that just by giving these patients with osteoarthritis vitamin B3 in high doses, he substantially increased their joint mobility from 90% to, this is in the babies of course, as you get older of course one's ability, joint function declines, but the older the person was, the better the improvement was. Now in his book he wondered if this had something to do with healing and repair mechanisms, but I think this is a reflection of he improved their mitochondrial function so much that he improved their healing and repair mechanisms and their joint mobility as a result. Again. Okay, so the point here is I have this kind of arbitrary line that we all live our 70 years and 10, and we gradually decline and die at that age. Mitochondria determine the aging process. So if you improve your mitochondrial function, you will improve your longevity. So the point is it's never too late to start treatment with all this stuff. And as I say to my chronic fatigue syndrome patients, okay, you might feel rubbish now, but if you put all this stuff in place and keep it there, you'll live much longer. So if you have perfect genes, then you can potentially get to 120. And there is one lady, Jean Calment, who achieved that. Or if you trash yourself with fags and booze and dangerous lifestyles, then you're going to drop off the perch earlier. So that's the expected, and again, that's the unhealthy lifestyle. And that's the unhealthy, click it again. But if we get on the treatment line, then we can slow the rate of aging and restore normal longevity. And again, I think that's the end of that. Click on to the next one. Okay. So so this is the strategy for treatment. I make the energy bucket as large as we possibly can. And secondly, identify how energy is being used and wasted. And so we get the differential right. Now, that's all the theory stuff. The next PowerPoint, do you mind getting on to the next one? I think that's finished that one. There's another which is treatment. I'm going to whiz through the treatment. I'm mindful that we've only got 20 minutes, so I'll trot along as fast as we can. But all this stuff, it's essentially in my books, and the slide, the PowerPoint, of course, anybody can take with them. If you don't want to buy a book, that's fine too. Now, it's quite clear from my experience that we don't have enough therapists to treat patients as they should be. And what I'm finding as I get older is it takes me longer to see any one person sort through everything because I'm learning more and there's more to get through. So I'm coming to there's only one person that can get you well, and that's you. You've got to get your head around these difficult ideas and put it in place. But what I am finding is that as I get older, and perhaps wise, although my daughters don't agree with that at all, what I find is that the very basic things done really well will get you an awful long way. So what are those basic things? As Churchill famously said. Now, this is all from my second book, Sustainable Medicine. And the point here is that in the treatment of absolutely everything, not just chronic fatigue syndrome, but cancer, heart disease, dementia, autoimmunity, whatever, or just living to a healthy age, there is what I call a basic package of treatment, which we should all be doing. Don't wait until you get sick. If you're well, put in place now. And that basic package of treatment is, first of all, the Stone Age diet. Humans evolved over 2.5 million years eating a Stone Age diet. And the essence of that diet is that we've powered our bodies with fat and fibre. And then we ran into problems for two reasons. First of all, we had the agricultural revolution. And when the agricultural revolution came along, we started to power our bodies with starches. Now, the population of the world shot up. But believe you me, the rich bastards didn't eat that. That was fed to the peasants and the slaves. And that allowed the Egyptians to build pyramids and great works to be done. But the wealthy people stuck with their Stone Age diet because they felt healthier and they lived longer. In fact, a third book's coming out in May, which is about diabetes and metabolic syndrome. And there's a lovely quote in there from Herodotus, who reports on the Ethiopians who visited the not the Philistines, the Greeks, essentially the Ethiopians said, and to what age do you expect to live? And not the Greeks, the Persians. The Persians very proudly said, we expect to live to 80 years. Oh, they laughed. That's because you eat shit, by which they meant they put compost on their crops and they ate starches. And the Ethiopians, who they ate boiled meat and vegetables, they expected to live to 120. So the diet is really important. Now, vitamins, minerals, and essential fatty acids. Because of modern agriculture, we're all deficient. I don't bother to do nutritional tests on people now who are not taking supplements because I know what the answers are going to be. They're going to be deficient in minerals and vitamins and essential fatty acids. And the reason for that is that there is a one-way cycle of minerals from the soil into plants, into animals, onto us, and we throw it away. And you look at MAF figures or DEFRA figures, or as the Welsh farmers like to call them, death ray figures, DEFRA figures, the micronutrient content of our food has declined since chemical farming. So the calcium levels are down, the iron levels down, the magnesium levels down, the copper levels down, and so on. And on top of that, we don't exercise like we should. So we don't consume the volume of food that we should, and therefore we don't have the volume of micronutrients coming in with that. So my view is we should all take a basic package of multivitamins, minerals, essential fatty acids. Sleep. As a nation, we are sleep deprived. Why? Because we have electricity and we have fun things to do in the evening, with like watching televisions and playing computer games and going out. And as a result, we are sleep deprived. In fact, there was a study done at the beginning of the 20th century, before electric lights, and the average sleep was about 9 to 10 hours. In the winter more, and in the summer considerably less. And in fact, during medieval times, during the winter, they absolutely went into hibernation and would go to bed very early, maybe 4 o'clock in the afternoon, as soon as it got dark. And then they would wake in the middle of the night and tell stories, and then get off to sleep again, and then sleep through again. And again, staying warm, keeping not burning energy was an important survival mechanism for the winter. Do you remember that lovely lady called Hannah? Oh, I can't to my head again. Who was discovered in a Yorkshire farm? What was her name? Hawkswell. Hannah Hawkswell. And that's exactly how she survived the winter. She lived on her own. And she spent during the winter, she spent her whole time in bed. She would get up to feed the cattle twice a day, and the rest of the time she spent in bed, because that was the only way she could survive the winter. Pacing activity is really important, as we've discussed. Sunshine and light, really important. You know, we all go mad in the winter because we don't get enough sunshine. Chemical burden, psychological aspects, and avoid infections and treat aggressively. Now, I'm whiz through these because these are, next slide. So I've talked about this. This is all in my book. There's not time to go into the detail, so we'll just flash through these, keep going. But this is all what I call the basic package. The Stone Age diet, detail of the Stone Age diet, and again, I say this is the diet that I use more than any other diet at present, which is the original Stone Age diet based on fat and fibre being the most important fuels for the body. And the trouble with sugars and starches is they predispose us to infection because microbes can only survive on sugars and starches. And of course, many of my patients have got chronic infections and other reasons as well that I won't go into, but it's in my chronic fatigue syndrome book. Micronutrients, talked about this. These are the sort of doses of things that I think everybody should be taking on a regular basis. Hemp oil is cheap, including the cooking. Vitamin D, everybody's deficient if they're not taking supplements. In fact, the NHS normal range for vitamin D is 30 to 60. My private lab's normal range is 75 to 200. If you live out in Africa, normal range is 150 to 200. We're all vitamin D deficient. Sleep, we've talked about that. It's really important we sleep, and I spend a lot of time with patients talking about sleep. And again, exercise, and again, and for my ME patients, that's pacing. Sunshine and light, really important. Again, lots of more detail in my sustainable medicine book. And again, reduce the chemical world. We live in such a polluted world. I mean, I do a lot of fat biopsies on patients to measure their toxic load. I have never seen somebody with no chemicals in their fat. We are all polluted. We live in a polluted world, and we live in equilibrium with that. We can never be free from them, but what we can do is try to keep the body burden down as low as we possibly can. And essentially, the chemical load comes partly from our fermenting gut, which we address with the ketogenic diet, but also, let's say, from the outside world. And they are pesticides and volatile organic compounds. I've got lots of ME patients whose ME has been triggered by exposure to organophosphate pesticides, organochlorine pesticides, and because they're fat soluble, they end up in our fat. Now, if you get warm, if you sweat either by running or exercise, ME patients can't do that, hot bath, hot shower, you literally boil off those chemicals onto the lipid layer of the surface of the skin, and they can then be washed off from there. This is Norman's next job that he's in the throes of doing at the moment. I've been collecting data from my patients before and after doing these heating regimes. And just looking at the raw data, you can see the toxic burden comes down reliably well with those heating regimes. Again, anybody can do that. Say hot bath will do it. My ME patients, because they're so intolerant of heat, I tend to recommend far infrared sauning, which is we can get the skin hot without increasing the core temperature, which makes it more tolerable. And then heavy metals. Again, whenever I've done tests for toxic metals, I always find a bit of lead, a bit of mercury. We can never reduce our body burden to zero, but we can keep it as a lower level as we reasonably can. And part of the reason we tend to load up with toxic metals are for two reasons. Firstly, the fermenting gut. One of the products of the fermenting gut is hydrogen sulfide, and that binds with metals that we ingest and converts them into a mercury sulfide or a lead sulfide or whatever, which is much more readily absorbed than the inorganic metal, with the potential to bioaccumulate. And if we are deficient in a mineral, such as selenium or such as zinc, the body will grab something that looks similar, and of course mercury is a trivalent cation. It's a little bit like selenium. It'll grab that instead, or it'll grab lead instead. So by improving your micronutrient status, you protect yourself against these toxic metals. Chemical exposure, again, I'm not going to go through that. There's lots in the book. I'm not going to go through that. There's lots in the book. Avoiding infections, is an obvious cause of fatigue syndromes, and an obvious trigger for fatigue syndromes. Next one. Okay, that's about avoiding. Again, how to avoid infections. It's just basic nursing skills. I always think that one of those dangerous things you can do is to send your child to university. because you know, they get crap diets, you know, they're stressed by their work, they're meeting people from all over the world and picking up endless infections, you know, including glandular fever and sexually transmitted diseases. They're put on the pill, or the girls are anyway, which is a major risk factor for chronic fatigue syndrome because it induces a metabolic syndrome, and the pill is mildly immunosuppressive. They're vaccinated, which again is a major trigger for chronic fatigue syndrome. And then when they get sick, they just keep going. They take loads of paracetamol, or aspirin, or Lemsip, and they suppress their symptoms when they should be resting up and giving themselves a chance to get rid of it. Okay, and again. And oh yeah, again, it's really important that we don't symptom suppress with drugs. If you've got an infection, don't take paracetamol or aspirin. We run a fever for a very good reason. Fevers kill microbes. Microbes are very temperature sensitive. But that is the standard, you know, advice that's dished out. We should go to bed, get warm, rest, allow our immune system to have the energy in order to deal with that infection, whatever it may be. And again. Okay, keep going. Okay, and again. Okay. Whenever I see somebody who's got chronic fatigue syndrome, I'm always interested in how that illness began. What was the trigger that caused that? And very commonly, it's a post-viral trigger. Next one, next slide. I think this is work that's been done by Martin Lerner in America, who started working in 1993 with chronic fatigue syndrome, post-viral chronic fatigue syndrome patients. And he's now published 4 studies. And the essence of his work is that Epstein-Barr virus is causally involved in about 81% of post-viral chronic fatigue syndrome patients. And he has been treating that with valacyclovir and getting very good results. Next one, again, the details of that is on my website. And I'm not going to go into it. This is some of the results that he gets. And next one. Okay, that's the regime. 1 gram every 6 hours. Valacyclovir is quite a fat-soluble drug, so taken with a fatty meal you get better absorption. And it's a little bit like treating HIV, I think, or hepatitis C. It's all about reducing the viral load to a level when the immune system stops reacting against it. And his treatment is for months, and for some people for years. And he monitored improvements. He established that there are improvements, clinical improvements, as well as ECG monitoring. Now, I don't do ECG monitoring because I don't have the facility for that.
What about lysine and arginine balance?
Well, I don't have any scientific basis for that. I mean, there are lots of natural antivirals that are out there, but we have to stick with the pure science, and we have to look at the stuff that actually works, and there's a biologically plausible explanation for that if we're going to be taken seriously. But yep. There are other antivirals that could be used.
But
Again?
This learner treatment, that's very expensive.
It's not too bad. It's about 120 quid a month. It used to be very expensive. What I do is I have to monitor creatinines at 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months. And now many of the labs are offering blood tests on a finger drop sample of blood. So it costs about 20 quid to get a creatinine, so that's kind of doable. And patients, they can just prick their finger, a couple of drops of blood, and get that checked. And that, because sometimes the GPs aren't supportive.
You've had Epstein-Barr. Does that stay in your body?
It does. Most of the herpes viruses do. And as I see it, the body does a deal with those herpes viruses and says, you leave us and me alone, and I'll leave you alone. But if the body becomes compromised in any way, then you'll get your shingles, you'll get your herpes in your lips, you'll get your genital herpes. And I think you'll get your flare of Epstein-Barr virus too. And many of my patients with glandular fever-induced, chronic fatigue syndrome say, I feel as if I've got my glandular fever back again. And when you look at their antibody titers, they're often very high. So the immune system is active against that, and I think that, as I call it, has the potential to kick an immunological hole in the energy bucket. So Epstein-Barr virus is a real baddie. And that's about the cost of the regime. I say, it's not cheap. But compared to having somebody off work and sick, it is cheap. It's very inexpensive. Next one. And again, this is another one that's rearing its ugly head at the moment, which is Lyme disease. I've sat on the fence for some years about Lyme disease and saying, is it important or is it not? But you may have heard of Armin laboratories in Germany, and Dr. Armin has developed a technique called ELISpot. Again, there's lots of details about how that test works. But essentially, it shows us if the immune system is active against the antigens tested. And again, there's an increasing body of evidence to suggest that treatment of Lyme can be very helpful in patients with fatigue syndromes. Next one. He doesn't just do this, he does other tests as well. That's his laboratory. If you go onto my website, you can access the blood test direct from Armin Laboratories. You don't have to come through me. There's a company in Cambridge who handles it, and people can get tested. Again, if somebody's got a gradual onset of fatigue without an obvious infectious trigger, then these are things I think of. Now, metabolic syndrome, it's a dreadful name, but essentially, if you are running your body on sugars and starches, then you will eventually get metabolic syndrome, and if you live long enough, you will get diabetes. And that is a major risk factor for fatigue syndromes. If there's shopping lists of other symptoms, headaches, irritable bowel, migraine, arthritis, and I used to work with a lovely doctor called Dr. Anthony, and she maintained, I can remember in the 1980s, she said, all arthritis is allergy. I thought, oh, no, I'm not sure that's right. But she's not far wrong. I think a huge amount of arthritis is allergy. And when I put people on elimination diets, often their arthritis improves. But a major cause of arthritis, I think, is allergy to fermenting microbes in the gut. And the idea here is that if you're eating high sugar, high carbohydrate diets, those sugars and starches, they get fermented in the gut instead of being digested. Now, there's an enormous amount of research being done about the gut microbiome as we speak. It's increasing exponentially. But the point here is that if you've got these abnormal microbes in the gut, they can get into the bloodstream. It's called bacterial translocation. If you Google bacterial translocation, you'll find loads of evidence about that. So we get these microbes in our bloodstream. Now, most of them, thankfully, don't cause any harm, and we excrete them in our urine. But there is potential to sensitise to those microbes and get allergic to them. And I suspect that many modern diagnoses, like polymyalgia rheumatica, like temporal arteritis, like venous ulcers, like chronic urticaria, I think those are allergy to microbes. I think that's the mechanism by which people end up with those clinical pictures. Hypothyroidism is incredibly common. Dr. Kenneth Blanchard, who is a consultant endocrinologist in America, estimates that between 20 and 40% of Western women are hypothyroid. It's a very common problem. Why? You're iodine deficient. I've never done a measure of iodine and found somebody with adequate status who isn't already taking an iodine supplement. The main iodine antagonists are bromides, which are used as fire retardants, and fluoride, which is used in dental treatments and so on. So we're quietly knocking off our thyroids all the time, and correction of that is really important. Mitochondrial function we talked about, adrenal function, again, that's an easy test to do to diagnose that. I'm not going to go through all this because we have, but that's the package of treatment for mitochondria. It's in the book. It's on the PowerPoint if anybody wants to copy that. Keep going. Again, we talked about thyroid. That again, lots of details in my book. Keep going. I'm not going to talk about that. Adrenal function, ditto. Circadian rhythms, again, ditto. It's all the important things. Keep going. These are all the inflammatory conditions that I see when the immune system is fired up. The immune system has the potential to kick an enormous hole in the energy bucket, either for reasons of allergy, allergy to foods, and the big three are gluten grains, dairy products, and yeast. So everybody's got to avoid those, just for starters. Or for reasons of allergy to gut microbes, as we just talked about, and autoimmunity, and of course chronic infection. If the immune system is activated, that kicks a hole in the energy bucket. And everybody's immune system is activated. How do I know that? One measure of inflammation is an ESR, erythrocyte sedimentation rate. Now, when I was at medical school in the 1970s, the normal range was 1 to 10. It's now 1 to 20. Why? Because everybody's inflamed, and the normal ranges have changed. The goalposts have been moved. If you've got an ESR above 10, then to my mind, you're slightly inflamed, and that's the immune system being busy. So all these things to reduce the pro-inflammatory forces that switch the immune system on. And again, And again, those are all the various tools that I use. Desensitization techniques, which I'm not going to go into. Keep going. Probiotics are anti-inflammatory. That seems to be helpful. And then this one in particular has been used to switch off allergy to foods. And again, that's just a resume of improving gut function. Again, this is all in my, keep going, in my chronic fatigue syndrome book, the Sustainable Medicine book. Keep going, keep going. These are the ways that we get rid of pesticides through heating regimes and soldering. And again, doctors, again, are very dangerous people. And I know all about this because I've had lots of General Medical Council hearings about this. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story now. At Christmas, I did a Freedom of Information excerpt to the General Medical Council. And cut a long story short, I'm the most investigated doctor in the history of the General Medical Council. I've had 30 separate investigations.
A lot of people are out to get you.
I know. But thankfully, not my patients. All the complaints either came from the doctors or the GMC. None of my patients complained.
Right.
Bless them. Thank you, guys. I'm sure. And again, they're very dangerous. After cancer and heart disease, the most common cause of death in Western society is the medical profession. Drug side effects, medical investigations, doctors' errors. In fact, when doctors go on strike, death rates fall. And there are 3 separate studies in different areas showing that that's the case. Hospitals are incredibly dangerous places. You pick up infections, you get rubbish diets, so beware of doctors. Again, so again, always ask the question why, and say start with the basic package and then go on to the bolt-on extras. It's just time, I think, for this little bit at the end. And again, okay, so you need the knowledge, the tests to diagnose, the tools of the trade, and additional expert guidance. Next one. Now, this is something I'm setting up at the moment, which I'm calling the Natural Health Service. And the idea is that it's a website where any patient can access any therapist. And that therapist might be a doctor, might be a consultant oncologist, it might be a physio or an acupuncturist or whatever, or it could be an expert patient. And the idea is it's going to be a marketplace where anybody can access anywhere. And there'll be a feedback page so that therapists can establish a reputation. So if you give a crap consultation, then the patient will say, that was a crap consultation. And guess what? They won't get anybody else going to them. But if they're helpful and they can give good advice that's constructive, they can generate a reputation and build on that. Next one. That's it. That's it! Viruses and infections that we inhale get stuck on sticky mucus, coughed up, and dropped in the stomach. And what should happen is they should drop into an acid bath of a stomach. And hypochlorhydria, i.e. lack of stomach acid, is a major risk factor for infection. Now you can easily test if you're hypochlorhydric by doing a bicarbonate challenge. So you take a teaspoon of bicarbonate in the water and swallow that glass of water, and you should burp within 2 or 3 minutes. If you don't, then you don't have stomach acid. It has to be on an empty stomach. And stomach acid, say, is a major defense against infection. Secondly, vitamin C. It's humans, fruit bats, and guinea pigs are the only mammals that can't make their own vitamin C. It's a 4-enzyme step to get there, and humans are missing one. So we have to eat vitamin C. It has become a vitamin. Now, if you scale up from what my pet dog Nancy or my horse or my pigs make, humans need at least 2 and probably 4 grams a day. Vitamin C is a really important defense against infection. And the third thing is vitamin D. Vitamin D, again, is highly protective against infection. And one of the reasons why we get flu epidemics in the winter is because there's no sunshine and everybody's vitamin D deficient. Zinc is another, the immune system, as I say, requires energy and raw materials. Energy is all about all the stuff we've talked about, mitochondrial function, thyroid function, so people are hypothyroid at risk of infection, people who have poor mitochondrial function are at risk of infection because they don't have the energy to power the immune system to fight that infection. But the immune system is greatly demanding of zinc and selenium. And again, when I measure people's levels of zinc and selenium, if they're not taking supplements, they will be deficient. So, to prevent infections, good package of nutritional supplements, a low GI diet, make sure you've got an acid stomach, and that would get you a long way.
What about flu jab?
I see so many people either have their ME triggered by or made much worse by flu vaccination that I say, don't go there. Now, I've had a whole General Medical Council hearing.
I just had flu. I would like to have not had flu.
I know, but that flu vaccine doesn't guarantee that you won't get it. You're much better off sticking with nutritional supplements to prevent yourselves getting infection than relying on vaccinations. I am very cautious about vaccinations with my ME patients because they have such potential to make them better. Vaccinations are very pro-inflammatory.
But
Not
flu
my
can
words.
kill, can't it?
I beg your pardon?
Flu can kill. I mean, just poor old Patricia's got flu.
Well, there's
She's
no.
been really
Okay, well, I can't argue against the anecdotal.
Yeah.
But the point about vaccinations is they're very pro-inflammatory, and they are not my words, they are the words of Dr. Yehuda Schoenfeld, who is an Israeli consultant immunologist. And he is really flagging up the point that we are in a very pro-inflammatory state because of Western medicine with their vaccinations and high sugar diets and exposures to chemicals and exposures to toxic and heavy metals. These are all switching on the immune system. And switching on the immune system is a dangerous business because the immune system can kill you as well. Yeah.
What you just mentioned about the immune system is interesting because last year Columbia University, one of the top research facilities in the world, Lady Hording, along with Ian Lipkin, they found that the first 3 years people with ME had their immune system was raised, and then afterwards it was lowered. And quoted lots of people this afternoon, but you've not quoted people from Columbia University, Stanford University, Newcastle University, where Julian Newton worked. All these people who are looking into dysfunction in the nervous system and the immune system, they're not looking at mitochondria.
Well, you have to, when it comes to nervous system, I always think you have to look very carefully about what is the messenger and what is the cause of that. I know autonomic dysfunction has been blamed as the cause of POTS, if you like, but I don't think it's the cause of, I think it's just the messenger. And the point here is that I think POTS is caused by poor energy delivery to the heart. It's much easier for the, and if the energy delivery to the heart is poor, then it doesn't beat powerfully as a pump. And that's why my severe ME patients like to lie down, because it's much easier for the blood to be circulated on the horizontal than on the vertical. In fact, when you move from the horizontal to the vertical, you have to increase your cardiac output by about 20%. Now, if you're already in, say, borderline heart failure, the heart can't do that. So initially when you stand up, to increase cardiac output, the heart beats faster. So that's the tachycardia bit. It's a bit rather a flabby beat, but it's faster. And you can maintain blood pressure for a while, but then again, if the heart's beating faster, it's using more energy, it can't sustain that, and suddenly the blood pressure then drops precipitously.
Well, they've also found that blood volume is lower with ME.
Well, that is also going to be a function of kidney function and possibly adrenal function as well. So I think those are symptoms of the problem, not the fundamental cause of.
It's not, but Julian Newton has said that if these areas can be addressed, there is a treatment there.
I agree, but I mean, I don't think she's come up with a treatment which is very effective yet. But what I do know is that when I treat my patients as I do with the ketogenic diet and the mitochondrial package and correcting their thyroid, the POTS just melts away, just disappears.
Well, Julian Newton suggests drinking lots of water and upping your salt intake.
Correct, but that doesn't necessarily put it in the right biological compartment. Yes, we can drink salt, yes, we can drink, but that might just end up as edema. It just might mean you pee more. It doesn't, just drinking salt water doesn't necessarily put it in the bloodstream where it's needed to increase the blood volume.
This anecdotal has helped me a bit.
Good.
And Julian Newton does know what she's talking
I
about.
know. I've had long conversations with Julia. I've been trying to persuade her of the mitochondrial ideas, and she's on the way, but not quite there yet. She's a lot. Okay, I'll have to try harder.
But Dr. David Bell had the salt water many, many years ago. So it's not a new idea.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about, with the whole energy thing, about menstruation, because my daughter's 18 and she has ME, and when she menstruates she really suffers.
Yeah. Mhm.
She's literally like that, can't move for a week and so much pain. So she uses the pill to sort of regulate that, and she
Okay.
only sees bloods every 3 months at the moment because it's so awful for her. And I just wanted your advice,
Well,
sort of in general.
I don't have a simple answer to that. I have to say I don't like the pill because it induces metabolic syndrome and it's immunosuppressive and it's a major risk factor for chronic fatigue syndrome. In fact, when we when Norman analysed the figures rather, the numbers of women coming through for testing compared to men, the women outnumber the men by about 2 to 1. So and I think that it's the pill and HRT which puts women at greater risk of fatigue syndrome than anything else. But first of all, menorrhagia can be hypothyroidism. So the first thing I would check would be her thyroid. But I suspect that heavy periods is also symptomatic of metabolic syndrome. And I haven't had the time to do it yet because I've only been getting interested in the ketogenic diet for a year or so. But I would put on the ketogenic diet and you may well see significant benefits from that. It's certainly a good treatment for menopause or hot flushes. Yeah, at the back?
Yes, you mentioned that nutrition has been an issue. I'm doing a bit of research at the moment. I've come across cucumber.
Uh-huh.
Apparently it has a lot of vitamins.
Cucumber?
Yeah.
It's 99% water, isn't it?
Well, it's in the
It has
past.
silica and some
Okay.
hormonal effect as well, but
Okay.
yes, depending on where it's grown and the soil.
Okay,
That's right. It's meant to be it has a lot of water.
okay.
It has a lot of nutrients, and apparently it is also a substance or a food, that can provide you energy for a sustained period, in a sense. What do you think of that?
Well, the answer is I absolutely don't know, but I have a very simple approach to this. I mean, I got interested in the ketogenic diet because of research done for athletes. And essentially, the endurance athletes function much better when they are running their body, when they're powering their body with fat, not carbohydrates. And there's 2 reasons for that. First of all, the athletes that carb load get their glycogen stores up in the liver, and the muscle, they can store about 1,700 calories worth of energy, which gets them to about 17 or 18 miles. So the marathon runners, as they call it, if they're running on carbs, they hit a wall at 17 or 18 miles. The Americans call it bonking, but we call it hitting a wall, you'll be relieved to hear. Now, if you, so basically your fuel tank is just 1,700 calories. If you are keto adapted and you are running your body on fats, you have a fuel of about 140,000 calories. So you can do back-to-back marathons and Ironman challenges without having to eat anything at all. And the second important point about the ketogenic diet is glycogen has an osmotic pressure. It holds water, and it holds water in the liver and in the muscles. So those athletes are carrying an extra maybe 1.5 kilograms of fluid that they wouldn't otherwise carry. When they're keto adapted, they lose that water. And what the athletes find is that when they're running on ketones, and the main one is beta-hydroxybutyric acid, they can increase their athletic performance by about between 7 and 15%. Now that is massive. That's the difference between an also-ran and a gold medal, winning performance. So for the endurance athletes, the top ones are going keto.
Are we to follow, Mo Farah's,
Mo Farah.
Mo Farah?
Well, I'd love to look like him.
Now you do.
He's advertising at the moment a lot of these corn nutrients. Is there a way to deal with energy level?
Well, I mean, the key thing is fat and fibre. We should be fueling the body with fat and vegetable fibre, not sugars and starches. That's the very simple message. It's not a high protein diet, there's a lady there.
Yes, with the ketogenic diet,
Uh-huh.
how does that fit with everyone having to cut their meat intake in order to cut greenhouse gases?
Well, first of all, I'm not interested in the world. When a patient's sitting in front of me, I want that patient to get better. Bugger the rest of the world. That's the first thing. Secondly, it's not a high protein diet. It's the protein content should be about the same. It's fat and fibre that are the key things. Fat is a very benign fuel. But I suspect the main problem comes from when we cook meat and we burn it and you get all those oxidized fats, which are bad news for us. And I suspect, but I don't know, that problems from meat arise if we're fermenting starches and we start fermenting meat as well. But I don't know. But it's fat and fibre is the key thing. Yeah.
I've got two questions. Firstly, so I have problems eating fats. It triggers stomach problems. So how to manage that when you want to increase the amount of fat that you're eating?
Well, first of all, you have to ask the question, can you digest? I mean, the body changes according to demand. And if I've got somebody who's been fueling their body on sugars and starches, then they will have very poor production of pancreatic enzymes maybe, and very poor production of bile. I mean, we need bile to emulsify fats in order that they can be absorbed. But to produce bile, you need fat, because bile is a fat-soluble liquid. And in fact, the reason we're seeing epidemics with gallstones at the moment is because people are eating sugars and starches, they're eating low-fat diets, the bile is concentrated, the bile salts precipitate out, and we end up with gallstones. So, and then the medical student thing is, it's the fair, fat, fertile females of 40 that get the gallstones, because they have metabolic syndrome. It's a manifestation of that. So you have to do it gradually. So you gradually increase the fat in your diet, and you maybe accompany that with pancreatic enzymes and maybe stomach acid, and build it up gradually. It's like my horse. When I change my horse's feed from team chasing mode to out in some, I don't suddenly stop her oats, so she's got nothing. You gradually wind it down, and then in the autumn when you want to get going in, you gradually wind it back up again. So you just have to be nice to your body.
The second question was, so I had Amy when I was 17, so that's like 23 years ago now. So sort of 90-95%.
Yep.
Most of the time. But sort of, I think my question is, menopause, how does that then come and influence, and does that become a sort of greater risk factor of things changing in your body, and sort of how to manage all of that?
Well, as we age, we become biochemically less efficient. And my view is that as we age, we have to work harder in order to maintain our wellness. And sometimes people come and see me and they say, I haven't got ME, I just want to live to my full potential. And you do exactly the same stuff. You do the ketogenic diet, you discipline about sleep, you take a basic package of nutritional supplements and so on, and free from chemical stress. But I'm coming to the view that as we age, we get less good at making certain key nutrients. One of those, I suspect, is coenzyme Q10. When I measure levels of CoQ10 in people who aren't taking it, they're invariably deficient. We just don't have the molecular machinery to make it as efficiently as we should do. Another, I suspect, is pregnenolone. Pregnenolone is the most upstream of all the adrenal hormones. In fact, all adrenal hormones start life with cholesterol. The first biochemical step is to pregnenolone, and that takes place in mitochondria. What happens as we age? Our mitochondria go down, we get less good at producing pregnenolone. Ditto the chronic fatigue syndrome patients. So maybe that's, as they call it, an acquired metabolic dyslexia. You see, the trouble with us menopausal women is we're on the evolutionary scrap heap. Nature doesn't care if I'm dead tomorrow. If I haven't had my kids and passed the Olympic, flag and genes on, then it's too late. So as we get older, we have to, as I say, box clever in order to live to our full potential. And if that means taking some extra supplements and being a bit more disciplined about everything, then so be it. But pregnenolone is quite helpful for menopausal flushes. Yes?
What kind of Q10?
I tend to use ubiquinol these days. At least 100 milligrams, 200 milligrams pretty much gets it right for everybody. Stephen Sinatra, in his book, he's the consultant cardiologist in America who treats mitochondria. He has some of his patients up to 500 milligrams or maybe a gram of CoQ10 a day, but that gets rather expensive. I've got one of my patients whose history is in the Sustainable Medicine book. His GP very kindly prescribes him 500 milligrams a day, so he's a lucky boy. Ubiquinol seems to be better assimilated, so it's a little bit more expensive, but as I call it, you get more bang for your buck with ubiquinol.
Do you think E. coli could have caused the chronic fatigue syndrome in a person?
Well, E. coli is a normal constituent of the gut. There are different strains of E. coli.
Yeah, I think it's a different strain. It made my friend extremely ill, and now she's exhibiting all the sort of symptoms that you're talking about, and nobody knows. Well,
yes, any infection can trigger a chronic fatigue syndrome because, as I call it, it punches an immunological hole in the energy bucket. And again, a ketogenic diet I speak a lot about. I talk a lot about my patients about the fermenting gut. And E. coli is a major gut fermenter. Yeah. And if you're fermenting in the upper gut instead of digesting, you see the human gut is almost unique in the mammal world, because the upper gut is a sterile, digesting gut for meat and fat, like my dog Nancy, but the lower gut is a fermenting gut for vegetable fibre, like my horse. And problems arise when either we overwhelm our ability to digest, or we eat so many carbohydrates that the upper gut starts to ferment. I mean, the best example, of course, is Helicobacter pylori. You know, even the conventional doctor are aware of that as an upper gut fermenter. Small bowel bacterial overgrowth is increasingly being recognised as, you know, fermenting gut. Treatment, low carb diet. I've now had several patients with Barrett's esophagus, which is a pre-malignant condition, obvious fermenting gut, put them on a low carb diet, and the Barrett's esophagus disappears. They get better. In fact, I have one guy with an esophageal tumour who recovered completely on a ketogenic diet. And we now know many cancers are infection driven. And I think that the epidemics we're seeing at the moment, esophageal cancer, stomach cancer, and bowel cancer, are sugar starch diets. And, you know, because they're infection driven. I've lost the point. I know I've strayed a bit there.
That's all right, that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you very much. No, most helpful. Thank you.
Leaky gut.
Yeah.
I had some bowel tests and my mucus is incredibly low, like 1% of what it should be. I had them done again and I've managed to get to like 5%, but still really low. I mean, have you got any suggestions?
Okay. I never do leaky gut tests because anybody who has any sort of inflammation in the gut will have leaky gut. And you know, essentially leaky gut the inflammation will either be caused by allergy to foods or the wrong bugs in the gut. And a test which is quite useful would be a comprehensive digestive stool analysis with parasites, which gives us a bit of a handle on what's going on. It's not a perfect test, but it gives us a bit of a guide. But, you know, the bottom line is starve the little wretches. You know, don't feed them sugars and carbs because that's what they love to ferment. Restore normal digestion, so test for hypochlorhydria, take pancreatic enzymes, maybe take bile salts, maybe take high-dose probiotics, which you can easily grow, and the way of growing it's all on my website, and that will get you a long way. You know, so many problems start in the gut. If you get that right, you know, so much else falls into place. And if you don't get the gut right, you can't absorb all the micronutrients that you're expensively pouring down your throat.
Can I just ask about the protein element? What if you're either can't afford that much meat or you're vegetarian or vegan? Is there something?
Well, the answer is it's much harder work. And you know, I don't ask my patients to do anything that I don't do. And I certainly couldn't survive on a vegetarian or vegan diet. I just, you know, it would be very boring. You'd have to have an awful lot of coconut oil to power yourself. I mean, it is theoretically possible, but it would make for a dull old diet.
So it would be more literally like more coconut oil.
Yeah, I mean, coconut. I mean, when we're talking about fats, broadly speaking, there are two types. The way I think about it, two ways. First of all, we have the medium chain fats, which are 8 carbon fats, which are the desirable fuels for the body, which would be meat, fat, lard, if you're not allergic to dairy, then butter, coconut oil, chocolate fat, and palm oil. They are the medium chain fats that are fuels. We then have the long chain fats, which are the vegetable oils, essentially so the fish oils, the vegetable oils, and so on. Now, in nature, there's no such thing as a bad fat. They're all good. The thing about the medium chain fats is they're saturated fats. So if you think of them, they've hydrogen ions all the way around, so they're short, stiff molecules, they're very tough, they're solid at room temperature, you cook them, they don't change their shape, they're very safe, good fats for cooking with. Now, in nature, all the oils are all left-handed, and they're unsaturated. So they're either monounsaturated, so they've got a kink there, or they're polyunsaturated, so they've got a kink there, i.e. they're bent, and they're left-handed oils. Now, if you heat them, or you hydrogenate them, they flip into a mirror image. They flip into a right-handed fat oil, which is called a trans fat. Now, that's the one that doesn't fit enzyme systems. And if it doesn't fit enzyme systems, it clogs things up, gets in the way, risk factor for heart disease, and so on. So the key is cook with the saturated fats, the lards, the butters, the coconut oils, and so on. And the vegetable oils and the fish oils, have them cold. You know, drizzled on your vegetables, French dressings, mayonnaises, or whatever. And keep them as the left-hand cis forms.
Oh, Sarah, there's a question here.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
I was just going to ask a question about sleep.
Yeah.
Because I know people with ME CFS, sleep is really difficult.
Yeah.
They're exhausted,
Yeah.
but they can't sleep. They're wired,
Yeah.
but tired,
Yeah.
they wake up lots of time. You know,
Yeah.
obviously it's all tied in.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
why
Okay.
is that happening?
Okay. Well, of course, in the short term, I just give them whatever drugs they need to sleep, just to get going, just to impose a circadian rhythm. We then have to ask the question, why are they not sleeping? there's no doubt a major cause of poor sleep is metabolic syndrome and hypoglycemia. Now, the sugar and the starch addicts, carbohydrates, are having to eat very regularly through the day. It's muesli for breakfast and honey, bad boy. It's sweet drink mid-morning with biscuit. It's sandwiches at lunchtime. It's cake in the afternoon. It's pasta in the evening. So it's like they're having to top up with fuel all the time. What happens at night? You don't eat. What happens? Your blood sugars fall. Now, the brain can't easily switch into fat burning. And when the blood sugars fall, its answer is to pour out adrenaline to bring the blood sugar up again. But of course, the adrenaline wakes you up. So nocturnal hypoglycemia, and often what gives the game away is people say, oh yes, if I go downstairs and have a sweet cup of tea and a biscuit, then I can get off to sleep again. So nocturnal hypoglycemia is a major cause of disturbed sleep. Secondly, sleep is often disturbed because of sleep apnea, which can be obstructive because you're blocking off your airways, or central and the brain forgets to breathe. Now the poison patients have the brain central sleep apnea. And so, and again, there are tests that can be done to determine the two. The obstructive sleep apneas are the snorers and the noisy breathers. And they obstruct because they've got swelling of the airway. And that can occur because of allergy. So dairy products, dairy allergy will be a major cause of obstructive sleep apnea. Hypothyroidism, and as we've told you, between 20 and 40% of all women are hypothyroid, so they get some obstructive sleep apnea. Pickwickian syndrome, which is when people are grossly overweight. But in metabolic syndrome, we tend to retain fluid, and that can obstruct the airways as well. So that would be a possibility. And thirdly, another major one is what determines our circadian rhythm are thyroid hormones. So in nature, TSH spikes at midnight, 3T4 spikes at 4 o'clock, and T3 levels come up at 5 o'clock. And then the rising levels of T3 kick the adrenal gland into life. So then we get a rush of cortisol and DHEA, and we wake up, with the light. And what determines all that, of course, is sunlight via melatonin. So there's a major hormonal aspect to that. So melatonin at night is helpful, bright light in the day, but of course that's difficult with the severe MEs because they don't tolerate light. So, that's another problem. But it's all those things coming together. So I'd say, ketogenic diet, really important. Again, get the thyroid sorted, think about allergy and obstruction.
Tiny quick point on melatonin. My daughter's prescribed it and we've just been told it's been blacklisted.
The nonsense about, it's ridiculous. In America, you can go into a drugstore and get melatonin. A child can go and buy it. In this country, mustn't give it to children under the age of 12. But guess what's the first thing the paediatricians use for treat sleep disorder? Melatonin. It's physiological. I can't see that it can have any possible malign effect.
She's 18 actually, and the paediatrician prescribed it first, and she had that, and then
Well, there you go. It's a nonsense. But, dare I say it, it can't be patented. So, follow the money.
You can get melatonin, from the food you eat and the plants. It can be supplemented in your diet if you want to.
Yeah. Okay. Couple more questions. Yeah.
I actually wrote a question there, but I'll ask it. Have you got any experience with using supplements like fumaric and succinic acid as a supplement to Krebs cycle?
Okay. The question is, what about other supplements to support the Krebs cycle? The point is that the common things are common, and the common rate limiting steps are all the things we're measuring. And how do we know it works? Because papers number 2 and 3 show that patients taking that regime get better. So it may be that there's the odd patient for whom that's helpful, but it's not a common rate limiting step. The vast majority of patients get well with the mitochondrial package, the CoQ10, the carnitine, the B3, the D-ribose, the magnesium, and the B12. It's all the details.
Is there any, for the patients that find it useful, is there any side effects or disadvantages of taking those?
Taking supplements?
No, succinic and fumaric.
I don't know. I have no experience of. Yeah.
My 19-year-old daughter has ME and endometriosis. Other than the ketogenic diet, which I will recommend she goes on, which is quite difficult, she's at university, but are there any other supplements?
Well, it begs the question, what causes endometriosis? And I don't know what the fundamental cause is, but there is definitely a yeast connection somewhere. Whether it's yeast allergy driven or yeast somewhere around, but there's, if you Google endometriosis and yeast, you find loads of references. Some people do well on antifungals or nystatin, but again, low carb diets. But there isn't an easy answer to endometriosis, and if you've got established endometriosis, then you need to see a good surgeon.
She's
give,
had surgery, but it made it worse.
Bless
She
her.
also has adenomyosis as well.
Yeah, well, but
she is on the pill, and at the moment she's on double dose of the pill.
I know. Well, I just so hate the pill.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had a whole GMC hearing about the pill, believe it or not, because it's.
I mean, I don't like it as well, but what other options?
Well, it would be a long story, and you need to get. And I'm not going to, but there is a yeast connection. That would be my main clue to follow. And endometriosis is also associated with hypothyroidism, so I look at that area as well.
Fiona has a question, and then John.
I was just going to ask about the gender difference in the population.
Yeah.
I mean, you've partly explained it with maybe hypothyroidism in women that is not diagnosed, but
I think those are the two main ones. I mean, I don't know for sure, but we've got about 800 figures, is it 900 figures for people who had mitochondrial function tests, and we just went through the gender.
It's about 2 to 1, whereas in some other studies it's like 3 to 1. But the thing is that there's been research or studies before that teachers and nurses, people who get exposed to a lot of other people who may or may not be ill, they have the highest rates. So because there are more female teachers than male teachers, that maybe comes into it. I don't know. It's
so this guy, they've been very patient.
Sure.
Are doctors in training taught anything about ME down to the mitochondrial level?
No, I mean the problem with doctors in training is, and I know this because my ex's stepdaughter is a medical student. The training of medical students now just appalls me from what she's saying. They don't think causation at all, and the whole of medicine is being reduced to a tick box exercise of that symptom fits that drug. So headache, there's no question about what's causing the headaches. Is it allergic? It's just paracetamol deficiency. Depression, has become SSRI deficiency. Arthritis has become aspirin deficiency. So they're not thinking causation anymore, and this is so dangerous because we have, as I keep saying, we have symptoms for very good reasons. Symptoms, the body's way of telling us there's something wrong. Do something about it. Fix it. If you suppress them, that underlying pathology continues amok. I mean, one of the drugs I hate more than anything else are the acid blockers, like omeprazole or lansoprazole, because they stop the symptoms of indigestion, but they don't address the underlying cause of indigestion. And what do we know about lansoprazole? First of all, it's a major risk factor for osteoporosis. Why? Because you need acid in the stomach to absorb minerals. Now, does your doctor tell you that when they start you on that? I don't think so. It's a major risk factor for the fermenting gut, and I suspect that the fermenting gut is what's driving our current epidemics of esophageal cancer, gut cancer, and so on. Those drugs are real bad news, but people just get put out like Smarties.
I've got a thing I'll talk to you. I have personal experience. I'll tell you about it some other.
Okay.
Well, I don't know. Jan, you've been waiting for quite a while.
I had put some questions, and I think some other people did have written some questions. So I don't know if any of those written questions have been addressed. But since I'm now on the floor, I'll ask 2 of them. One is, are the tests that you use, have they been scientifically validated and tested for reliability? And the second question is, and therefore do doctors accept them? And the second question is, there's actually quite a lot of research that suggests that vitamin supplements may have either not an effect or actually even a harmful effect when compared with getting the vitamins and minerals from food. So I'm just wondering whether you always
Well,
go for supplements rather than food.
Well, it would be lovely to go for the food, but it's not in the food. And you have to eat a certain volume of food in order to get a result. So I'm afraid I use the bog standard cheapo, vitamins and minerals, which are perfectly well absorbed and, to my mind, do a perfectly good job. The most.
There is some research, for example, about, pregnant women were given vitamin supplements and actually they
Well,
did
the point
worse
about vitamins and minerals is they are synergistic. They work with each other. Now, many of this testing have been done on single nutrient interventions, which are almost a complete waste of time, because what we're trying to do is restore normality, and everybody's deficient. So that's why I have a basic package which has got all, 12, 14 minerals, a whole range of vitamins, essential fatty acids, vitamin C, vitamin D. Everybody has that as the basic package because there are so many interactions between them. There's an organisation, the Orthomolecular Medicine group, that pointed out that now the 25th year in succession, there have been no deaths recorded from any vitamin supplements, anywhere in the Western world. They are fabulously safe. And again, whenever you see research, always ask the question, who's funded it? And what you'll find is there'll be a drug company at the back of it trying to besmirch the name of. Coming back to the mitochondrial function test, we are looking very hard for another laboratory to shadow John McLaren's work. We've got one in the pipeline who's doing such at the moment. When John does his mitochondrial function tests, he does them in quadruplicate. He does them 4 times on each test to make sure he gets consistent results, and then it goes out. I've known John as a biochemist since the early 1980s. I don't laugh. My father was his GP, as it happened at one stage, and his tests are. Well, we call him the magician because he seems to be able to conjure up, he's a very practical man and he seems to get fantastic results, which are producible. But most importantly for me is they square very well with the clinical picture I'm sitting in front of them. I mean, I don't send clinical patients...
Are they accepted by the medical?
Well, of course they're not, because, it undermines the whole of their thinking. That is the problem. I do see that doctors are overwhelmed at the moment, but the trouble is they're not even asking the right questions. And if they're not asking the right questions, they are never going to see the answer.
I have complete confidence in John McLaren Howard.
I'm not making any...
No, but...
I'm not casting doubt on any individual...
But you're absolutely right. It does need repeating. And what I want is to find another laboratory who does it, send paired samples down, make sure we get similar tests. And my guess, it probably won't happen in this country. It'll be in Eastern Europe or China or India or something like that. And that's where we're looking at the moment.
Okay. One over here, please.
You've had your share.
I supplement ME and my daughter does, and my cousin. And is there anything genetically?
Mitochondria come down the female line. So I very commonly see mother-daughter, mother-son relationships, and you can often trace it back. Oh yes, grandma was always tired, and on it goes. And again, I don't know if it's the same, but your cousin may well be a female. Yeah, it is. Yeah. Well, that squares because say mitochondria belong to female. So we hear about the 3 parent families where you get male and female, and then the mitochondria. But the mitochondria are female. So yes, it comes down the female line.
But there is another factor as well, that people in a family quite often live in the same house, or live in the same area, so they're exposed to the same environmental pollutants, they have the same diets, etc. So just because it's in a family doesn't prove that it's...
It doesn't, but that often comes up in, of course, taking history.
I was told that the link in my family would be to do with the MS.
MS? Well, MS is not a genetic condition, it's an environmental condition. And the reason we know that is because if you look at Japanese people eating a traditional Japanese diet, they have a very low incidence of multiple sclerosis. But if you take those Japanese stock and you move them to California and you put them on a Western diet, they acquire the same incidence of multiple sclerosis as Americans. So multiple sclerosis is not a genetic condition, it's an acquired condition. I mean, I have 1 or 2 families where it runs in the families. Guess what? They're farming families. Guess what? They've been poisoning themselves with chemicals since the Second World War.
Because my father had MS. And when I got the ME, they thought it was the MS originally.
Different pathology.
Okay, David.
We haven't really heard, how do your patients, what's the outcome? Do you have any sort of scientific data on?
Well,
I know it's very difficult because you haven't got a control and everything, but so it's always going to be...
well, this was our third... you have to... Norman's probably the best person to answer that question.
No, the thing is, I look at the repeat tests, but the patients have to pay for the repeat tests.
Mm.
So they probably will have a repeat test only if they're still ill. They've improved some, but they would like to improve better. If they get completely better, they won't have another test. If they don't get better at all, they say, the hell with this Sarah Myhill, it's rubbish. And
But
then they
does Sarah,
disappear.
do you have,
I
do you have
can't-
failures? Do you have
Oh,
people
yes.
who don't?
I always have a hardcore of people with whom I struggle.
Yeah.
But as I get on, you know, I'm getting better at it. But the trouble is, see, I can't do research
No.
because, you know, for us, I can audit.
Yeah.
And what I do is I audit like mad, I collect all the figures, but that's uncontrolled. Yeah, I mean, this is urgently in need of a study.
Because when I take my car to the garage, to use yours,
Yeah.
I don't really care what's what's
Correct.
gone wrong. I just want it to work at the end of the day. And it's a bit like I want me to work.
Correct. But I
Do
can't.
your patients work at the end?
Correct. But I can't fix it. You have to do it yourself.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you know,
And
I
that
can tell
requires
from you.
knowing what's under the bonnet.
Well, I can tell you, you're apple shaped. You've got metabolic syndrome. You've got to start with that. I can be very rude and very abrupt.
I always need a biscuit.
There you go. There you go. Diagnosis.
And I take a Meprazole.
There you go. It's another
Worst
disaster.
nightmare,
You've got fermenting gut and metabolic syndrome.
Pre-diagnosis.
Okay.
There's this lady thing, friendly patient, yeah.
So how do you stand with that?
It depends how toxic it is, and for some people it's really toxic, and absolutely don't tolerate. I mean, my view is it should at least be filtered, and you get fairly good filters from Boots or whatever, and that's a very good starting point. Again, water in plastic containers is a problem because of phthalates, and we now know that they're really toxic. They're in the World Health Organization's dirty dozen, phthalates. They're really nasty things. So, you know, you do your best, but at least filter.
You have an opinion on blood donation? That was a scare story a few years ago.
Well, yeah, with good reason. I mean, and that resulted from Judy Mikovich's work, who demonstrated the presence of XMRV virus in patients with fatigue syndromes. And I don't know if you read her book, Plague, but it's a really worthwhile read. I mean, the XMRV story hasn't been put to bed. It is still a possibility, but it's such a hot potato, nobody dare go there. And that's why she got slaughtered scientifically. But I think that the end of that story is yet to come. It's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. It squares, and as you point out, one stage, in fact, I don't know if it's still the case now, but you know, blood transfusions from ME patients were said, no, let's not do that because you know we might be giving somebody else ME as a result.
Well, that was the story.
Yeah.
And so there was a blood transfusion unit down the road.
Yeah.
So when I went in last day,
Yeah.
they said, oh, if you're feeling fine, we'll take it.
Well, nobody really knows, is the you know. And,
So I stopped. I didn't want to take the risk of giving anyone else.
well, that's that. But you know, we don't know the answer to that. But my view is that is a story that has not gone away.
Oh, over there. You're first, and then.
Would you treat a teenager with ME any differently from an adult?
No, exactly the same. Kids, teenagers, doesn't matter. You know, I have one lady in her 90s who came to me because she was fed up with her energy levels, and we did all the stuff I usually do. And she got back to it. She used to play piano for the kids to do ballet to, and she got back to her piano playing and had a very jolly few years. So no, the principles are exactly the same regardless of age. Well, a Meprazole wipes out stomach acid. So what we have to do is ask the question why that person has acidity and reflux, not suppress the symptom with the Meprazole. And the commonest two reasons would be allergy to a food or fermenting gut, i.e. too much sugars and starches. So what you do is you put them on the appropriate diet.
Yes, but I have a hiatus hernia, which...
I think that's a complete red herring. I think hiatus hernia is just an excuse of a diagnosis to explain reflux. You do the low carb, you know, the ketogenic diet, cut out the major allergens, and that will become a non-issue.
Okay, the last question over there, because we have to vacate this room fairly.
Yet on any of the trials, because I've had ME for about 20 years, is there any way of getting on a trial?
Well, it depends what the trial is for.
Research. I mean, because there is some research going on, but how do you get into...
No idea. My view is if you're going to get well, You've got to do it yourself. And you've got to get the knowledge and the information, which I hope is in my books. You know, the treatment is basically the nutritional supplements, which you can get online. and you know, tests I'm trying to make available so any person can access any test and say through the Natural Health Service, and then can access any therapist to help them. So that's, you know, it's happening as we speak. I hope to launch it in a few weeks, a few months' time, once it's been, you know, passed all its tick box tests. But you've got to do it yourself. Don't look around for somebody else to help you. You've got to grasp the nettle and do it yourself, because that's the only way you're going to get well.
Okay, I think we'll have to close it there, and thanks, Sarah, very, very much.